The sound of the strike echoed across the bridge, sharp and defining. An alien commander had just backhanded a human cadet for a minor infraction. For 3 terrifying seconds, nobody breathed. Then the entire human armada went dead silent, and the aliens learned why humanity doesn't need to scream to be terrifying. By the year 2142, the United Earth Naval Coalition, UENC, had spent decades trying to play nice with the galactic neighborhood. When humanity finally broke the faster-than-light barrier using the experimental CERN-Boeing slipspace drives, we were immediately thrust into a wider galaxy that was already heavily militarized, heavily divided, and incredibly arrogant. The dominant force in our sector was the Razizan hegemony, a species of 7-foot-tall armored bipeds whose entire culture was built on the concepts of dominance, physical prowess, and the unquestionable authority of the Alpha. To the Razizan, humanity was a curiosity. We were physically smaller, lacked natural armor, and possessed no biological weapons. They viewed us the way a lion might view a clever bird, useful, perhaps, but ultimately fragile. We were invited into the coalition fleet not for our military might, but because the proprietary fusion reactors designed by the Lockheed SpaceX Orbital Consortium were leagues ahead of anything the Razizan had managed to engineer. They wanted our engines. They just had to tolerate our people to get them. The integration was supposed to be a diplomatic triumph, a joint fleet combining Razizan dreadnoughts with human support cruisers patrolling the contested neutral zone near the Sirius sector. The flagship of this joint armada was the Vanguard, a Razizan capital ship the size of a small moon, commanded by High Fleet Master Trell. Trell was a veteran of a dozen brutal campaigns. He was covered in the ceremonial scarification of his people, a walking monument to violence and strict hierarchy. To him, the 100 human exchange officers stationed on his bridge were little more than glorified mechanics. Among those humans was Cadet Arthur Hughes. Arthur was 22, fresh out of the Annapolis Orbital Academy, and wore the standard-issue blue General Dynamics flight suit that made him look even younger than he was. He wasn't a soldier in the traditional sense. He was a systems savant. His job was to monitor the handshake protocols between the human slipspace engines and the Razizan's archaic plasma grids. He was quiet, dutiful, and possessed the kind of intense, laser-focused intelligence that made him invaluable to his superiors back on Earth. But to Trell, Arthur's quiet nature was a sign of submission. In Razizan culture, if you weren't barking orders, puffing out your chest, or physically imposing yourself on your subordinates, you were prey. For the first 3 weeks of the deployment, the tension on the bridge was palpable. The Razizan communicated through roars, aggressive posturing, and public shaming. When a Razizan officer made a mistake, they were struck or loudly berated. The human crew, by contrast, operated in near-total silence. Thanks to the Neuralink headsets developed by Raytheon's Defense Division, the human officers communicated via an encrypted closed-loop text network they called the chatter. To the aliens, it looked like the humans were passive, almost robotic, staring at their screens and never raising their voices. They lack spirit, Trell scoffed one evening to his executive officer, deliberately speaking in the translated universal language so the human bridge crew would hear. Look at them. They stare at their glass panels like frightened herbivores. When the syndicate pirates inevitably attack, I expect the humans to hide beneath their consoles. Cadet Hughes heard the remark. His jaw tightened, but he didn't look up from his diagnostic screen. He simply typed a quick command into the chatter. Hold discipline. Let him talk. Asterisk asterisk. On the UENC Aegis, the human command ship flying just off the Vanguard's starboard bow, Captain Richard Cole watched the telemetry data stream in. Cole was an old-school naval tactician, a man who had cut his teeth in the corporate resource wars of the 2120s. He knew the Razizan were pushing boundaries, trying to establish a pecking order. He had explicitly ordered his crew to turn the other cheek. Humanity needed this alliance. We needed the Razizan's territorial protection while Earth rebuilt its orbital shipyards. Keep your heads down, Cole had briefed his officers before the deployment. They're loud, they're abrasive, but they hold the keys to this sector. Do your jobs. Let them think they're the kings of the jungle. It was a pragmatic strategy rooted in human endurance. But pragmatism has a breaking point. and that breaking point was rapidly approaching the Sirius sector in the form of a hypervelocity debris field laced with stealth mines left behind by the Orion Syndicate. It happened on the 24th day of the joint patrol. The fleet was transitioning out of slipspace near the orbital rings of a dead gas giant. It was supposed to be a routine navigation check, a chance to recalibrate the Cernboeing drives after a long jump. The moment the Vanguard dropped into real space, the ship's klaxons began to wail. A deafening, guttural alarm echoed across the bridge, bathing everything in the harsh red light of the Razazan tactical displays. "Report!" Trell roared, his massive hands gripping the command console so hard the metal groaned. "Ambush!" a Razazan sensor officer barked back, his vocal cords straining. "Syndicate gravity mines disguised within a high-velocity asteroid cluster. They are closing fast. Impact in 40 seconds. Trell's eyes widened. "Raise the forward plasma shields. Full power to the frontal deflectors." At his workstation, Cadet Hughes was already running the numbers. His hands flew across his holographic keyboard, bypassing the sluggish Razazan interface and directly accessing the human-built reactor core. He saw instantly what Trell did not. "Commander," Arthur said, his voice tense but steady. "The plasma shields won't hold against gravity mines. The kinetic force will punch right through the forward deflectors and detonate against the hull. We need to route power to the port thrusters and angle our entry. We have to slide with the debris field, not try to block it." Trell whirled on the young cadet, his facial plates expanding in a display of pure, unadulterated rage. A subordinate, and a human one at that, was challenging his tactical command in the middle of a crisis. It was the ultimate insult to a Razazan Alpha. "Silence, fragile," Trell bellowed. "You do not dictate fleet maneuvers. I said full power to the forward shields. Do it." Arthur looked at the countdown. 28 seconds. If he followed the aliens' orders, the flagship would be gutted, taking 3,000 crew members with it. He didn't have time to explain physics to a warlord who solved problems by headbutting them. "I am overriding the helm," Arthur said, his voice dropping into the cold, flat tone of a pilot making a hard call. He slammed his palm onto the biometric scanner. "Override accepted. UENC protocol initiated." Asterisk asterisk. The ship's computerized voice hummed in English. Before Trell could even step off his command dais, Arthur forcefully rerouted the reactor's output. The massive Razazan dreadnought groaned in protest as its forward shields completely deactivated. Instead, the port thrusters flared with the intensity of a dying star. The massive ship violently pitched to the side, rolling its heavily armored dorsal ridge toward the incoming debris field. "What have you done?" Trell screamed, drawing his ceremonial sidearm. 10 seconds. The bridge crew braced for impact. The debris field slammed into the Vanguard, but because Arthur had angled the ship, the rocks and gravity mines didn't hit the flat forward deflector. They skipped off the angled dorsal armor like stones skipping across a pond. The gravity mines detonated harmlessly in the ship's wake, their concussive force actually pushing the dreadnought further out of the danger zone. Sparks rained down from the ceiling as secondary conduits blew, but the hull remained intact. The Vanguard stabilized. The fleet was safe. Arthur exhaled a breath he didn't know he was holding. He wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, turning to look at his diagnostic screen to check the reactor temperatures. He never saw the blow coming. Trell crossed the bridge in 3 massive strides. The alien commander didn't say a word. He simply swung his heavy armored gauntlet in a vicious backhand arc. The strike caught Arthur square in the jaw. The sickening crack of bone echoed through the cavernous bridge. The sheer kinetic force of the blow lifted the 160-pound cadet off his feet. He spun through the air and crashed hard against a steel bulkhead 10 feet away. He crumpled to the deck like a discarded rag doll, completely motionless. A thick pool of dark red blood began to spread rapidly from his head onto the pristine gray grating of the floor. "Insubordination," Trell snarled, spitting onto the deck near Arthur's unmoving body. He looked around the bridge, his chest heaving, reasserting his dominance. "Let that be a lesson to the rest of you fragile creatures. When a Razizan commander gives an order, You obey or you bleed. The alien guards by the door let out low, rumbling chuckles, amused by the display of strength. Trell turned his back on the bleeding human, expecting the rest of the UNC crew to cower, to avert their eyes in submission. He expected fear. He expected begging. Instead, he got the 3 seconds. 1 second. Arthur lay on the deck. He wasn't dead, but his breathing was shallow, his jaw visibly shattered. Every Razazan on the bridge puffed out their chests, waiting for the human reaction. 2 seconds. The low chuckles of the Razazan security guards died in their throats. Something was wrong. 3 seconds. The ambient noise on the bridge, the frantic typing, the quiet murmurs of human officers, the hum of the translation devices, simply vanished. Every single human on the bridge of the Vanguard stopped what they were doing. Hands lifted off keyboards. Diagnostics were ignored. 60 UNC officers turned their heads slowly, in absolute unison, to look at Trell. There was no shouting. There was no panic. There were no tears. No cries of outrage. No frantic rushing to Arthur's side. There was only a dead, heavy, suffocating silence. The humans just stared. Their faces were entirely devoid of emotion. Their eyes, hard and flat, tracked the Razazan commander with the predatory focus of a wolf pack that had just locked onto a target. Trell felt a sudden, inexplicable chill run down his spine. The silence was unnatural. It wasn't the silence of fear. It was the silence of a hammer being pulled back on a loaded weapon. "What are you staring at?" Trell barked, though his voice lacked the booming confidence it had held just moments before. "Return to your stations." Nobody moved. Nobody blinked. Suddenly, the Razazan communications officer gasped. "Commander!" "What? Speak!" Trell snapped, grateful for the distraction from the unblinking human eyes boring into his skull. "It's the human fleet, sir. The Aegis and all 41 human support cruisers." The officer's hands trembled over his console. "They've cut all audio and visual communications. The joint channel is dead." Trell frowned. "They are throwing a tantrum. Re-establish the link." "I can't, sir. They haven't just cut comms. They've gone completely dark. Electronic emissions are 0. Thermal venting is sealed." The officer swallowed hard. "Sir, they are combat locking us." Before Trell could process the words, the bridge was bathed in a new, terrifying light. The harsh red tactical displays of the Razazan ship were suddenly overridden by blinding, strobing yellow warnings. "Warning. Active targeting detected. ****. Warning. Deep space LiDAR paint detected. ****. Warning. Multiple kinetic firing solutions locked. ****. Through the massive forward viewport of the Vanguard, the Razazan crew witnessed something that defied their understanding of the fragile humans. The 42 human warships, previously drifting in a loose passive support formation, moved. They didn't maneuver with the slow, lumbering grace of the Razazan dreadnoughts. Thanks to the Lockheed SpaceX thrusters, the human ships snapped into a razor-sharp orbital blockade with terrifying violent speed. In less than 10 seconds, the human fleet had surrounded the Vanguard. Every single human ship had opened its weapon bays. Row after row of Raytheon-designed mass-driver weapons, the ones the humans claimed were only for clearing asteroids, were now deployed, glowing with the blue hum of charged magnetic coils. Every single barrel was pointed directly at the bridge of the Vanguard. "Shields!" Trell screamed, real panic finally bleeding into his voice. "Raise the shields. Power weapons." "I can't!" the Razazan helm officer cried out. "The human." "Who?" "The one you struck." He hardlocked the reactor controls when he initiated the override. "The system is encrypted. We have no shields, and our main plasma batteries are offline." Trell stared in horror. They were sitting ducks. A single massive dreadnought, completely at the mercy of 42 heavily armed human cruisers whose weapons were fully charged and locked. On the bridge of the Vanguard, the 60 human exchange officers finally moved. But they didn't draw weapons. They didn't attack the Razazan guards. In perfect, terrifying synchronization, all 60 humans slowly stood up from their stations. They unclipped their sidearms, placed them gently onto their desks, crossed their arms behind their backs, and stood at parade rest. They were silently, willingly offering themselves up as hostages, fully accepting whatever crossfire was about to happen. They weren't afraid to die. They were just waiting for the order to burn it all down. The main communication screen at the front of the bridge crackled to life. The static cleared, revealing the face of Captain Richard Cole of the UENC Aegis. Cole wasn't wearing his formal diplomatic uniform anymore. He had stripped off his jacket and was dressed in a combat gray undershirt. The ambient lighting on the human bridge had been shifted to crimson combat-ready status. Cole didn't look angry. He looked sad. It was a cold, terrifying sadness. Trell stepped forward, trying to salvage his pride. "Captain Cole, your fleet is committing an act of treason. Stand down your weapons immediately, or I will have every human on this ship executed for mutiny." Captain Cole looked at the screen. He looked past Trell, his eyes finding the broken, bleeding body of Cadet Hughes lying on the deck. Cole's jaw twitched. When Cole finally spoke, his voice didn't boom like a Razazan's. It was quiet. It was a whisper that carried the weight of a dying sun. "Commander Trell," Cole said softly, "for 3 years, the United Earth Naval Coalition has bent over backward to respect your customs. We have endured your insults. We have tolerated your arrogance. We have let you believe that your physical strength makes you superior." Cole leaned into the camera, his eyes turning to chips of ice. "But you seem to have fundamentally misunderstood our nature. We aren't quiet because we are weak. We are quiet because we spent the last 5,000 years almost entirely wiping our own species out of existence over petty insults. We are quiet because we know exactly what we are capable of, and we are trying very hard not to be those people anymore." Cole paused, and the hum of the magnetic coils on the human ships outside seemed to grow louder, vibrating through the hull of the Vanguard. "You just put your hands on one of my boys. You have 30 seconds to have your medical staff put him on a stretcher and move him to the airlock. If his heart stops beating, or if you speak a single word other than, 'Yes, Captain,' I will order my fleet to fire a concentrated tungsten volley into your bridge. We will crack your ship like an egg, and we will not lose a second of sleep over it." Trell's pride warred with his survival instinct. "You would sacrifice your own crew on this bridge?" he sneered, trying to call the bluff. Cole didn't blink. He simply tapped his temple, indicating the neural link. "Check your chatter logs, Commander," Cole whispered. "They already gave me the green light to fire." Trell slowly turned his head to look at the human crew on his bridge. 60 men and women stood unarmed, their hands behind their backs, staring at him with cold, dead eyes. There was no fear, only a terrifying, predatory patience. The alien commander finally understood. The humans hadn't joined the coalition because they needed protectors. They had joined because they needed a reason not to conquer everything in their path. They were a species of apex predators wearing a mask of civility. And Trell had just ripped the mask off. 20 seconds. Cole's voice echoed through the silent bridge. Trell swallowed hard, the dry click audible in the dead air. He looked at his guards, then down at the bleeding human on the floor. The alpha of the Razazan hegemony, a veteran of 1,000 battles, found himself trembling. "Medics," Trell croaked, his voice cracking. "Get the boy to the airlock. Now." The silence held heavier than gravity as the aliens rushed to comply. The Razazan medical team, a trio of hulking brutes accustomed to treating plasma burns and kinetic shrapnel wounds with crude, agonizingly painful stimpaks, hesitated. They looked at Trell, then at the unmoving body of Cadet Arthur Hughes, and finally at the 60 silent humans standing at parade rest on the bridge. The air was so thick with tension it felt like wading through deep water. "Move!" Trell roared, though his voice cracked on the syllable. The medics scrambled. They didn't dare touch the human roughly. With a gentleness that was entirely alien to their species, they hoisted Arthur onto a grav stretcher. The young man's face was a mask of bruised purple and crimson, his breathing wet and ragged. As the medics hurried him toward the primary airlock, The 60 human officers on the bridge of the Vanguard pivoted in perfect unison. They didn't follow the stretcher, nor did they return to their stations. They simply rotated to maintain their unblinking, cold stares on Trell. Through the massive forward viewport, the vastness of space was illuminated by the menacing blue glow of 42 human cruisers. The UENC mass drivers were fully charged. The targeting lasers, invisible to the naked eye but blaring loudly on the Vanguard's tactical HUD, painted the Razazan Dreadnought's bridge. "Captain Cole," Trell said, both hands gripping the edge of his console to hide their trembling. "The boy is in the airlock. Your medical frigate may retrieve him. Now stand down your weapons and disengage your targeting locks." On the view screen, Captain Richard Cole watched the telemetry feed on a secondary monitor. He waited until the soft chime of the airlock docking sequence echoed through his headset. "I have him, Captain." The voice of Dr. Gregory Hayes, the chief medical officer on the Aegis, crackled over the private human frequency. "Severe cranial trauma. Mandible is shattered in 3 places. Subdural hematoma. I'm putting him in a Medtronic stasis pod now. We're pushing Johnson & Johnson Biogel to stabilize the brain swelling. But it's close, Richard. He's hanging on by a thread." Cole's jaw muscles tightened. He looked back into the camera, staring directly into Trell's eyes. "We have our crewman," Cole said, his voice retaining that dead, chilling calm. "Then power down your weapons," Trell demanded, trying to summon the authority of a high fleet master, though he felt more like a cornered animal. "You have committed a grave insult to the hegemony today, Captain. Do not make it an act of war. Release the encryption on our reactor and stand down." "No," Cole replied simply. Trell's eyes widened. "What did you say?" "I said no, Commander," Cole answered, leaning forward slightly in his command chair. "You seem to think this was a negotiation. It wasn't. You proved today that you lack the emotional regulation required to command a joint coalition vessel. My men and women on your bridge will remain exactly where they are. My weapons will remain locked on your command deck, and your reactor will remain encrypted. You cannot keep a hegemony dreadnought hostage in deep space," Trell shouted, panic finally overriding his pride. "When High Command hears of this, High Command will thank me," Cole interrupted. "Because right now, Commander, you have a much bigger problem than me." Trell blinked, confused. "What are you talking about?" "Check your deep space telemetry," Cole said. "The sector scan you would have been running if you weren't so busy trying to beat my cadet to death." On the Vanguard, a Razazan sensor operator gasped. "Commander, slipspace ruptures. Multiple signatures. They are dropping into real space on our 6 o'clock." The space behind the Razazan dreadnought tore open. The vacuum boiled with Cherenkov radiation as a massive fleet materialized out of the void. They were brutalist, jagged ships painted in non-reflective black and armed to the teeth with illegal plasma cannons and scavenged military hardware. "The Orion Syndicate," Trell whispered, all the blood draining from his heavily scarred face. It hadn't been a random minefield. It was a snare. The gravity mines were designed to cripple a ship, forcing it to drop its shields and stop in open space to assess the damage. The Syndicate had been waiting in the darkness, watching, ready to pounce on whatever prey got caught in the trap. And now, thanks to the encryption Cadet Hughes had locked into the system, the Vanguard, the pride of the Razazan hegemony, a ship that carried 3,000 souls, was sitting dead in the water. No shields, no main weapons, thrusters offline. "They are launching boarding craft," the Razazan tactical officer screamed. "Commander, we are defenseless. We have to restore power." Trell spun toward the screen, abandoning all pretense of superiority. "Cole, give us the decryption key. If you don't, they will slaughter us. They will slaughter your people on this bridge." Captain Richard Cole looked at the tactical feed. A swarm of 80 Syndicate attack fighters and 10 heavy boarding frigates were burning hard toward the paralyzed Vanguard. "I know," Cole said. "Then release the reactor," Trell pleaded, his voice breaking. It was the first time in his life he had ever begged. "Sit down, Commander," Cole said softly. The transmission cut out. The screen went black. Trell stared at the blank monitor in absolute horror. The humans were going to let them die. They were going to use the syndicate to execute the Razizan, taking their own 60 exchange officers with them as martyrs. It was a level of cold, calculating ruthlessness that Trell couldn't even fathom. "Commander," the helmsman whispered, pointing a trembling finger out the viewport. "The humans? They're moving." The 42 human cruisers, which had formed a suffocating hostile ring around the vanguard, suddenly broke their blockade formation. However, they did not flee. They did not spin up their slipspace drives to escape the overwhelming syndicate numbers dropping into the sector. Instead, the UENC fleet pivoted as one single, terrifyingly synchronized organism. Thanks to the proprietary Lockheed SpaceX maneuverability thrusters, the human ships moved with a fluid, terrifying agility that completely defied the lumbering battleship-era logic of the Razizan hegemony. In absolute silence, the human cruisers slid through the vacuum, interposing their unarmored hulls directly between the paralyzed Razizan dreadnought and the incoming pirate armada. On the bridge of the Aegis, the crimson battle lighting cast long, harsh shadows across Captain Richard Cole's face. He watched the tactical map update in real time, his expression devoid of the adrenaline or panic that usually accompanied a deep space ambush. "Lieutenant Commander Jenkins," Cole said, his voice barely rising above a conversational murmur, cutting through the eerie quiet of the bridge. "Synchronize the targeting grids across the fleet. The syndicate is flying in a standard swarm assault pattern. They expect the Razizan to engage with heavy, slow-moving plasma barrages, which they intend to absorb with their forward thermal shields." "Fleet grid is synchronized, Captain," Jenkins replied, her fingers dancing across the haptic interface of her console with practiced mechanical efficiency. "General Atomics railgun capacitors are currently holding at 110%. Safety interlocks are disengaged. Firing solutions are locked on the primary and secondary enemy formations." "Excellent." Cole's eyes hardened into chips of flint. "Let's remind the Galactic neighborhood exactly why we decided to leave Earth in the first place. Open the tactical network. UENC fleet, this is Aegis Actual. Weapons are free. Execute hammerfall pattern on my mark. 3, 2, 1. Mark." Outside, in the cold, unforgiving vacuum of space, the syndicate swarm accelerated, burning their engines hot and confident in their absolute victory. They saw the small, relatively unarmored human cruisers moving into their path and dismissed them entirely. To the wider galaxy, human ships were known for their engines, their logistics, and their medical bays, not their firepower. The pirates charged their plasma cannons, fully preparing to swat the UNC vessels aside like annoying insects before boarding the helpless Razizan dreadnought to claim their prize. They never even managed to pull their triggers. Humanity didn't use plasma in ship-to-ship combat. Plasma, for all its terrifying heat, dissipated over vast distances. It could be deflected by thermal plating, scattered by magnetic shielding, and mitigated by a blade of armor. Humanity, a species born on a high-gravity death world and forged in the brutal grinding machinery of endless industrial wars, preferred something much simpler, much older, and infinitely more devastating. Kinetic energy. Every single human cruiser in the fleet was built around a central spine that housed 3 massive sequential magnetic railguns. When Captain Cole gave the order, 126 solid depleted tungsten rods, each the size and weight of a 20th century telephone pole, were accelerated to 0.004% the speed of light. There were no bright, flashy laser beams painting the void. There were no glowing orbs of plasma lighting up the darkness. There were only faint, split-second blue flashes from the human ship's magnetic coils, followed instantly by the total, catastrophic annihilation of the Syndicate's front line. On the bridge of the Vanguard, Commander Trell and his Razizan crew watched the viewscreen in stunned, absolute silence. The tungsten rods hit the Syndicate ships with the concussive, localized force of tactical nuclear weapons. The pirates' thermal shields didn't even register the dense, uncharged metal until it was already passing through them. The kinetic impact bypassed their energy defenses completely, punching through the heavily armored pirate frigates as if they were made of wet parchment. The ships didn't merely explode. They were structurally unmade. Entire heavy cruisers were violently ripped in half, their hulls collapsing inward under the sheer, unimaginable force of the strikes before blowing outward. The vacuum of space instantly filled with a rapidly expanding cloud of flash-frozen atmosphere, vaporized coolant, and pulverized metal. Before the Syndicate could even process that their front line had simply evaporated from existence, the human fleet fired again. Thump, thump, thump. The vibration of the human mass drivers echoed through the open comm channels. A terrifying, rhythmic heartbeat of industrial death. "By the ancestors," Trell whispered, his jaw slack as he stepped closer to the primary viewport, his massive hands resting against the glass. The human fleet moved with terrifying mathematical precision. They didn't roar battle cries over the open channels. They didn't boast of their kills. They didn't break formation to aggressively chase glory or hunt down stragglers. They fought like a cold, calculating machine. As the surviving Syndicate fighters panicked and violently broke formation, desperately trying to evade the invisible, instantaneous death raining down on them, the human point defense systems woke up to greet them. Thousands of automated Northrop Grumman rotary cannons tracked the erratic, desperate flight paths of the pirate interceptors. A silent, invisible storm of high-explosive depleted uranium rounds filled the empty space between the fleets. The Syndicate pilots didn't even have time to reach for their ejection handles. Their fighters were shredded into microscopic shrapnel, turning the space around the Vanguard into a terrifying mechanical meat grinder. In less than 4 minutes, the engagement was over. An Orion Syndicate armada that would have taken the heavily armed Vanguard hours to fight to a standstill, and likely cost the lives of hundreds of Razazan boarding defenders in brutal room-to-room combat, had been completely wiped from the fabric of existence. Not a single pirate ship managed to retreat into slipspace. Not a single human ship took a scratch on its paint. Slowly, deliberately, the UENC cruisers turned around. Their massive mass driver coils were still glowing a faint, angry blue in the darkness, venting heat into the void. They smoothly resumed their positions around the Vanguard. The invisible targeting lasers locked right back onto the Razazan command deck. The communications screen at the front of the bridge crackled to life once more. Captain Cole was sitting at his console, casually reviewing a datapad. He didn't immediately look up at the camera. "Commander Trell," Cole finally said, his voice flat, completely devoid of the adrenaline that should have accompanied such a slaughter. "I am sending a heavily encrypted data packet to your tactical officer right now. It contains the biometric decryption key that Cadet Hughes used to lock down your reactor grid." Trell swallowed hard, unable to pull his eyes away from the glittering frozen debris field floating outside his window. You saved us, Captain." Cole slowly raised his head, his eyes meeting the alien commanders through the screen. His gaze offered absolutely no warmth, no camaraderie, and no mercy. "Do not flatter yourself, Commander. I protected UENC personnel currently stationed on your vessel. Nothing more. The firepower," Trell stammered, his deeply ingrained cultural pride completely broken, his entire worldview shattered into pieces in the span of 5 minutes. "We did not know. The Coalition High Command did not know you possessed such weaponry on your support vessels. Why do you hide it? Why do you act so subservient, so quiet when you can do this?" "I already told you, Commander," Cole replied softly, leaning forward. "We aren't quiet because we are weak. We are quiet because we know exactly what kind of monster lives inside our DNA. For centuries, my ancestors ripped each other apart with those exact same principles of physics. We burned our own skies. We shattered our own continents in corporate resource wars. When we finally rebuilt and reached the stars, we made a solemn promise to ourselves. We would leave the monster behind.